Thank you very much, Professor Jha and the Desai Center. I am honored by the invitation to be here this evening. The subject that we are addressing, which contains the description of some companies in the world as platforms, is, of course, their favorite framing. They like us to think of them as the fundamental foundations of social life in the 21st century. That is not necessarily the only or the best way to frame the nature of what they are. But let us begin, at any rate, with the word platforms, which we now must think about in relation to the word democracy, about which we are all, in a way, better informed. The reframing of democracy in the 21st century is a technical activity. It is presently going on. We are changing what we mean by the word democracy because a government of the people, by the people, for the people, containing all of the power of the net, both to educate and to surveil, is a different kind of government than the one which gave birth to democracy, even in the India of the mid-20th century, let alone the United States in 1789 or the British monarchy of 1215. All of our traditions and all of our understandings are being updated now. People whose lives have only ever been lived in direct connection to the net are an increasing part of human society. And by the end of the lives of the middle-aged people in this community of thought we are at the moment, all human brains will be formed from birth in connection to the net. And every form of human activity will be conducted through the mediation of the net. Therefore, whatever democracy means, it will be determined in large part by the technology of the net. And I shall submit as we go along that the way the net either reinforces the democracy we have understood or destroys it will be determined here in India. So let me begin then by asking about the platforms. In the very infancy of the World Wide Web, before the web was 3,000 days old, a project began to replace its underlying structure with a new structure. The web is part of our understanding of an internet of peers, in which computers, on behalf of human beings, interact on terms of technological equality, offering and receiving services port to port, in the limitless opportunity that electronic communication offers, the most flexible geometries and the most powerful exchanges, operating according to a net in which the protocols are determined by consensus, and everybody is equally able to access and to provide. But the new technology model, which came into development intensively when the net was less than 3,000 days old, and which now dominates global society, was a system not of peers, but of behavior collectors, providing simple services in the net, like email, calendaring, social sharing, microblogging, and so on. All services easy to provide from any computer in a web of peers, but now provided centrally through forms of workload management we've come to call the cloud, which collect all the behavior that human beings express through computers. And because the computers we call smartphones are designed as hardware to collect as much human behavior as possible, the smartphone is the densest collection of sensors, gram for gram, ever developed by a human society. We have spy satellites in orbit, which are even more miraculous and thrilling, but they weigh a lot more. That light, thin, beautiful device in your pocket is a spy satellite aimed at you. And what we call the platforms are the companies which collect all of human behavior in return for price, so-called zero services of a very simple kind that people could provide for one another using much smaller computers without being comprehensively studied and poked at and experimented with by a great big behaviorist entity. What we call the platforms, we could in fact think of as a software form of life, possessing multiple organs that we call Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and etc., YouTube. Those organs are different forms of behavior collection in return for simple services, and they secure habitual human contact through the services they provide, and then they collect comprehensively all the behavior of that human being along with the aggregation of that human being's behavior with all the other human behavior being collected, subjected to pattern matching software, which we grandly but not very accurately refer to as artificial intelligence, but which does provide imminent insights based upon the large-scale aggregation of entire populations of human behavior. So that this software entity that we created, this multi-organed entity that is all the behavior collection devices and which metabolizes all that behavior and produces stimuli for more behavior, that entity of software which lives by metabolizing our behavior and maximizing our engagement with its sensors, gathers our behavior, analyzes it, metabolizes it, sells it to advertisers, and thus acquires the ability to interact with money. This software entity possesses a view of human behavior that's almost unprecedented in the history of human thought. This software entity possesses all of the information necessary to understand, as best can be understood externally, each individual human being, each decision made by each human being, particularly the decisions made in engagement with the entity. But it also understands the largest patterns in human social behavior. It sees everything from the fall of the individual sparrow to the content of the cosmos. And the only way in which human beings have ever described anything like this entity as it now exists is to call it the mind of God. But this entity is parasitically organized. This set of things we call the platforms, these organs of the entity, they draw from us in the worth of all our behavior far more than they give back in the world of simple services like email and microblogging and person-to-person SMS and group SMS, and all the services that they provide are not worth the trillionth in consequence to the human race of the behavior they collect. This parasitical structure, this entity, this parasite with the mind of God, is what is presented to us by the human beings who grow rich off its activity as the platforms. Now, the platforms, that is to say, the parasite with the mind of God, have become increasingly necessary to, among other things, electoral politics and the generation of public support and the dissemination of public information or misinformation, which is increasingly the business of the states that political parties and other political active entities seek to compete to control. What television broadcasting was to the world of 1960, WhatsApp more than is to the world of electoral politics south of the equator everywhere. And what the combination of the microbloggers and the photo sharers and the video pinup boards provide, or are forced to provide, or are refused the opportunity to provide to the citizens of societies around the world, democratic and otherwise, determines how the force of society is monopolized and employed. What control of radio did in generating the fastest moving genocide in human history in Rwanda, the social media control forces now do with respect to a very, very, very destructive and potentially ultimately dangerous war presently being waged by Russia in Ukraine, but which is also occurring in other societies around the world, a dozen we could name offhand at this moment. This relationship between the parasite with the mind of God, we call the platforms, and the states is increasingly intimate and fundamentally harmful to what we mean by democracy. Not only in the sense that autocracy is benefiting as well as democracy from the availability of the assistance of the parasite with the mind of God, not only that the alliance between the software entity and the global states is increasingly beneficial to the use of unilateral force, but because our very notions of democracy, as I said at the beginning, are at odds with the structure of society generated by the parasite, the platforms, the collection of behavior in return for services that enables the surveillance and social control of all society. It's worth spending just a few of our very valuable minutes this morning explaining some particular ways in which this is true that may not be obvious at first glance. We can all see the harm being done, but we may not have had the leisure yet in this fast-moving situation, just a few thousand days old, to have isolated what the fundamental conditions are that are being changed. Democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, is an exercise in understanding one another and negotiating with one another. That's how we achieve democracy, by listening to one another and by finding ways to make everybody satisfied ultimately with the justice of what we collectively do. But the parasite with the mind of God, the technology model of collecting behavior and using the collection of behavior to fund the delivery of simple services which are fully monitored and which produce more engagement and therefore more behavior to analyze and re-stimulate, that model separates us from one another. The intermediation of the net, the software entity that parasitizes our shared neural linkages, that structure makes us feel that we're in touch with one another when what we're actually in touch with is the intermediary pretending to be invisible. The result is that we do not actually hear and we do not actually negotiate. Everyone has come to understand, every literate citizen of every society has come to understand that something has changed in the way we use our words. And the phenomenon everywhere being diagnosed by the different observers in the different societies converges to this, that we are not actually hearing and negotiating with one another. We are confronting one another with high levels of engagement and low levels of ability to understand. That inability to understand expresses itself at the margins as belief in falsehoods and the maintenance of conspiracy theories and cults. But that's not the central part of the phenomenon. The central part of the phenomenon is the marginal reduction of our ability to hear and understand and negotiate with one another. That's the form of erosion of democracy at the lowest level that we are presently experiencing. Government of the people, for the people, by the people, is respectful of the people's rights, because the people's rights and government's rights do not oppose one another, they grow out of one another. We have made our effort at a more perfect union in order to enjoy tranquility and rights. But if we are to do that, then this identification of the rights of the people must be absorbed by government as an affirmative duty to bring the people their rights. There's no doubt whatever, as Mr. Desai so appropriately pointed out, that the overwhelming growth of the infrastructure of the net, the anatomy, not the physiology, but the pure ability to connect all of us together with one nervous system, which has expanded by orders of magnitude over the course of our lifetimes. There's no doubt whatever that that occurred with the assent and the support and the assistance of government doing what it ought to do, ensuring the growth of that anatomy which can bring health and prosperity to its citizens. But even in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's ruling in Puttaswamy, reminding government that it has a fundamental obligation to support the privacy rights of every person, we are still short of the law and the policy that would declare not merely that government must observe the rights, but that it must act to develop and make flourish the rights of the people. A democracy in the 21st century is a democracy of the net, an electronic democracy. But an electronic democracy savors and cherishes the privacy of its citizens and their rights to equality and to non-surveillance in their net. The parasite is not a democratic institution. A government which cherishes the prosperity and privacy and rights and self-development of its citizens is a government with a public health obligation to reduce this, like other parasites, near extinction. And therefore, we come to the last and most important part about the effect of the platforms or the entity, the parasite, with the mind of God upon democracy, because the platforms, the parasite with the mind of God, require of government something else. Its needs are as legitimate as any other biological needs. If the entity is accepted, then its biological requirement to collect every citizen's information, to collect all the behavior all the time, to maximize engagement all the time, to turn the direction of human communication in the direction of greatest benefit to itself all the time, becomes part of its program. Not a democratic program, but a program which can be fully understood as beneficial to society if it is pronounced and furthered and allied at every stage with great national institutions in the private and public sectors. If the public sector uses the facilities afforded by the parasite, if it makes interaction with the parasite necessary to the citizen's life, prosperity and well-being, if the private organizations that are the pillars of society become the local assistants to the parasite, accept its inward investments, and use their powers over infrastructure to further the business model of collecting behavior in return for free of cost trivial services of far less worth. If the pillars of the private sector profit by that structure in partnership with the parasite, then everybody is serving a vision of the national welfare, but not the democratic vision. This then is the problem that we confront. This is the difficulty that we are meant to consider. It's about the structure of the net's market in services. It's about how people get their email and do their social sharing and save their calendars and synchronize their devices and do all the other fundamental things which we can easily accommodate in a wonderful and definitely profitable net, but which do not depend upon behavior collection and monetization of behavior to provide those services, and which do not permit the platforms, that is the entity, that is the parasite with the mind of God, to structure a market in services in an anti-competitive and anti-democratic way. What does that really mean? Well, for one thing, the form of workload management we have come to call the cloud, which depends upon free software virtualization and the frictionless movement of tasks from place to place in a potentially frictionless global net, that structure we call the cloud is not intrinsically biased in the direction of centralization. Where Facebook, now Meta, used to refer to itself as a cloud play, that really depends upon what the structure of the cloud physically is. Let us imagine just for a moment, instead of large collections of parasitic tissue encrusted around the world's least expensive electricity, their cloud is really, after all, metabolizing human behavior and cheap electrons to produce high-value profits through control of the world advertising market. That's the actual wiring diagram. Let's imagine instead the profusion of all human society by the cheapest single-board computers we presently make, and all the better tricks that we will play with them year by year as we go. Imagine a cloud consisting of droplets, not a few concentrations of parasitic material clustered around cheap hydropower in Iceland, but a system of tiny little boxes, all of them consuming less power than the smartphones we currently carry around, providing services to one another, to our friends, to our families, to our small businesses, to our clubs, to our organizations, all of them using high security to prevent surveillance rather than to encourage it. And all of them engaged in offering us services not for free, but for such trivial cost that we can offer all of us to the world, and India in particular to the world. Good services in privacy, very profitably, using a cloud which belongs to human beings instead of which makes human beings belong to it. The free software revolution provides the entire software layer of that structure of society, just as it provides the entire software layer of all the platform structures of society. We made them possible by providing the software on which their infrastructure runs. The proprietary parts of their businesses are their surveillance parts. Those surveillance parts consume much more energy than the provision of the services that people actually use. They are busily decarbonizing themselves and arguing that they are totally acceptable from a carbon perspective because they are displacing other people's decarbonization activities because they can more readily afford them. But the total carbon footprint of the IT of the world is dominated by their surveillance, analytics, and advertising platform behavior. However you sort the carbon budget of the earth, they use way too much power surveilling and controlling people to provide them in the end with services that can be provided not exactly for free, but at an immensely smaller economic as well as moral and political cost. Now, where in the human race can we develop the understanding of how to change fundamental technology patterns so as to save democracy? The autocracies, of course, are not interested. The Chinese model of the net is the platform model of the net forever, everywhere that they can put it, because the parasite with the mind of God has a middle name, and the middle name is party, as Xi Jinping says. And the European Union is a producer and exporter of regulation, but never of technology patterns or of the industrial structures that make the IT of the world. And it shows no sign of changing its fundamental approach to its role in the IT policy of civilization. The US, my homeland, well, I mean, the fundamental understanding of all administrations over the last 8,000 days is that the platform companies, they never see it as the parasite with the mind of God. It's the platform companies, capitalism's dress. The platform companies are to the 21st century what coal and steel and then petroleum were to the 20th century, and they have the incumbency, the biggest stakes in the basic parts, and that's an American asset, and they mean to maximize its value. So, of the four corners of the human world, the crucial corner is India. Here is where all, to a first approximation, all the brains are. Software is an IQ business. Bill Gates said that. Infosys and Tata Consultancy Services were built on it. That's true. And the question is, which IT business is it? The parasite's business or democracy's business? The overwhelming growth, 3 or 4 orders of magnitude in the relationship of Indian understanding to the IT world that has occurred over the last generation is small compared to the, well, shall it be 5 or 6 orders of magnitude of growth in importance of the Indian part of our IT human race in the next 10,000 days. The question is, which technology patterns will be chosen? It comes to that. Here we are in the Indian Institutes of Technology, one of the greatest of all the pillars of the society that independence built, discussing what that most wonderful set of institutions, the entire technological education structures of Indian society, will choose to teach in the next 5,000 days. Or even just the next few hundred. Because the entire human race has come to understand that it did not understand what it was doing to itself when it allowed the parasite with the mind of God we call the platforms to collect all human behavior. The race is now on edge. Human beings want a new set of solutions, but they haven't the vocabulary in which to describe what those are or why they ultimately matter. So let us give that to them. The technologists, the business people, the policymakers, and the states themselves all will hear from us if we show it to them from the ground up. The principle of the free software revolution I helped to ease along was proof of concept plus running code equals change. The concepts of what it would take to replace the platforms utterly are proved. And we have running code that does everything inside them as inside freedom. So we're in a position to make the change anytime. But as John Adams said to Thomas Jefferson, revolution occurs first in the minds of men. And Ralph Waldo Emerson narrowed that down. He said a revolution occurs first in one man's mind. And when the Red Hat Company began as 4 people and worked its way up to the S&P 500 and was acquired by IBM for $32 billion, another one of those multiple order of magnitude growths in the world. When the Red Hat Company was young, it painted up on the wall of its reception area in its only place of business, revolution occurs first in one man's mind, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and they meant Richard Matthew Stallman. We can do it. The grip of the parasite on the states and the people that the states purport to represent and cherish is very strong. But the grip is strong only because the technology, weak as it is unchallenged. Let us challenge it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Moglen. Would you have some time for questions? Would you take some questions perhaps? Hello? Yeah, so if anyone interested in questions, please raise your hand, and then I could ask you to please go ahead. Hello? Yeah, Uttara, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Professor Thank you, Professor Moglen. That was a very interesting talk that you gave. Sorry, I can't turn my video on, but I will ask my question anyway. So yes, thank you so much for that talk. I suppose what I am curious in understanding a little bit better, and the way that I look, I think that the framing of this parasite with the mind of God, that is the platform, is so interesting. But the way that I look at it is that the parasite itself seems to be this form of neoliberalism, and neoliberalism more broadly, which is really I think, the genesis of this kind of surveillance that exists and this intrusion into privacy. And it is also a nexus between governments and businesses and the economy more generally. So can we really then talk about the dismantling of just the mind of God without talking about the dismantling of this parasite? And if we are to keep firms profitable in the way that they are today, wouldn't that just give rise to different forms of the same kind extractive behavior that exists? I feel like the surveillance aspect of it is a manifestation, given the kinds of technologies that we have today, but not necessarily the root of the problem. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, or help me sort of untie this knot if I'm getting it mixed up.
No, I think you have seen profoundly. I wish that you could come with me to my Computers, Privacy, and the Constitution class later today, because there I want to talk about the First Amendment and freedom of expression, and that, of course, relates in a different way to what you're saying. The parasite, it has a camouflage material, as entities do, to avoid being taken apart, and so it has political clothing, coloration that occurs in different places. You're right, of course, that in our societies it wears neoliberal coloration. In China it does not. And it's useful for us to remember its cross-cultural environment in order to try and separate the portions of its physiology that we are most in need of confronting and the ones that are peripheral. I'm not going to argue that its political ideology in any given place is entirely peripheral. It isn't. You could get particularly Marxist about it and just say that there's superstructure and base in all of this, or you could say from a technical point of view that there are multiple components, and what we want to do is to use our force on the place where we can best employ it. This is why inverting the cloud and taking both the hardware and the software structure of delivery of services to a lower scale has an important effect. Let's just ask about profitability as you do. What would be the global economic outcome of a world in which people who knew how to provide services provided privacy respecting services to other human beings on a sliding scale, depending on the wealth of the society and the individual involved in using those services? I'm really asking about what would happen if, for example, in India, there were 10 million proton mail businesses, right? Marketing good forms of effective privacy, actual VPNs instead of so-called VPNs, and SSH proxy cache browsing, and strongly encrypted mail, and all the various things that any business in the world now assumes it can have, to human beings at the prices that in their societies represent the right price, which obviously would allow a profitable operation if the price in India for Indians were zero. If what happened was that India became a provider of privacy-based services to the world at prices out in the world that would allow Indians to have privacy-based services that replaced the platforms for zero. And what would occur? It wouldn't be altogether good. Political parties would not be better off. Whether Reliance would be better off depends upon whether Reliance is with the program of doing this or against the program of doing this. It can make a ton of money either way. From your point of view, and maybe mine as well, that would actually affect the quantity of neoliberalism in society. But the most important thing that it would do would be to make the parasites living impossible to earn in India. And that would be a profound and revolutionary change, not just in India, but in the human race. Mishy and I have written about this before. I'm not saying a thing that's new to say, but I hope you can understand why I think it's a responsive answer to your question.
Yes, thank you. You couldn't see, but I was nodding along.
Yeah, thank you. So perhaps we could take a couple of questions together, Professor Moglen. So Professor Sandeep, please go ahead, and Varun, and then Pravat.
Thank you, Professor Moglen, for a very interesting talk. I just wanted to I'd heard some years ago that there was a project that attempted to build infrastructure which would take away the need for telcos. So with commodity wireless equipment that's already there in your phones or on your machines, and with various kinds of routing protocols, it seemed that we did not really need large central telcos. And there was a lot of open source software that came out to support this. But then it appeared that these projects face some kind of difficulties and repression. So is there anything that you know about this that you're willing to share your perspective on?
Good, thank you. I will respond. I gather there's a second question.
Yes. Varun and Pravat. Varun, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So thank you, Dr. Moglen, for a great talk so far. And it's been really great to hear your articulations of what is frankly probably age defining in a way. We are sort of seeing the Anthropocene being controlled by the parasite with the mind, as you put it. So I work at NASCOM, and we deal with these issues in the more brass tacks level. One of the levels at which we're starting to see digitization manifest itself in India is through the provision of digital public goods by the Indian government itself, be it through the development of identity infrastructure through the Aadhaar project, be through the development of payment protocols known as the Unified Payment Interface. And then you see that model being replicated throughout different sectors and parts of society. What's worrying right now is that the scale at which this is taking place is unprecedented. We don't know if we have the right infrastructure legally in place to prevent misuse by the state. And I fear that the vision that you painted of China is a vision that people in Indian society have pointed out as a possibility that we may tend towards. Are there, in your research, have you come across alternative imaginations of governments providing digital public goods that India can look towards as better role models, where it is genuinely privacy respecting and perhaps competition enabling rather than becoming about state centralization? I genuinely don't know of any other states that we can look towards as examples. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Varun. Prabhat, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, Professor, I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
My question is somewhat kind of a tangential in the order, in the sense, while I appreciate the points made, as I would like to hear your perspective on the point, like, what is the way forward? Like, is it dismantling, or can we not use the same framework, like what we call as the parasite with the mind of God? Can we not use the same to, I mean, the people who are sane to fight against the, or at least highlight the demerits of this system? Because otherwise, what other means do we have to reach out to the masses? Because this system exists because of its efficiency. Why not use the same to counter it? Your views, like, for example, let's say print. Whether you want to use it for what purpose depends. Like nuclear technology, for what purpose, it is up to us. So in that, I'll rest my case. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Prabhat. So yes, thank you.
I mean, these are three very shrewd ways of asking the question: how will we operate differently? How do we actually make an alternative, right? And each of them poses that question at a slightly different level. Let me start at each of the different lowest levels where we are. The India stack is, as was said, happening faster than anywhere else in the world. It is the most important effort at understanding a comprehensive structure for digital relations between government and market and society that anybody is trying. And it could only be as ambitious as it is for the reason that I alluded to in my talk, which is that it is based upon the available efforts of more highly trained intelligences than anywhere else in the human race. For which very reason, as was suggested, its pace of growth is well capable of outpacing the ability of social understanding. And therefore, the question becomes, how could we make this infrastructure safer to build faster than we understand? Here, there really is a simple answer for NASCOM. NASCOM should take the view that India Stack must be implemented not only using open protocols or open standards, but free copylefted software. There must be a reference implementation of everything that India Stack connects to or does within the control of government that exists in a copyleft environment in which the commons grows in freedom all the time. And anything which is contrary to privacy or integrity of human beings is removed from the software in the same way that it is removed from the Linux kernel or any of the other tens of thousands of free software projects that we use all the time to run our machines. If you look at all the India Stack discussion which has gone on at each level about Aadhaar, about UPI, about all of the various other pieces, government data lockers, and etc., you will notice the nuance that the entrepreneur community has always talked in terms of open standards and open APIs and open this and open that, but never about actually requiring everything to be copylefted free software and for the infrastructure of society to be held in commons. The India Stack should be the Linux of 21st century society. It should be the operating system kernel and the connectors to all of the applications that civil society and the market consist of. That's just fine. But it can't be based upon a single identity token held in a file that will never be hacked, never, 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 and which connects all government surveillance of public activity to all private activity in the market, always, always, always. That's not good engineering. And if it were copyleft engineering, we would just patch it. So that's the first step in that largest question of how can the fastest digitizing society on earth do it in the way which ensures respect for freedom. The question of free software telecoms is deep and interesting. It involves both free software called OpenBTS, which will turn any laptop plus a little radio device into a cell phone base station to provide mobile communication systems that are free of anything except their obligations at their uphaul, at their backhaul. It includes all the efforts at providing handset software stacks which consist only of free and changeable bits. And it consists of the interactions between all those forms of free software development and global telecommunications regulation, which is a very well developed and deeply legally confrontational system. If governments want to keep things from happening in the radio spectrum, they find lots of ways to do it. But I don't think that's essentially a conspiracy on the part of telcos to exist. It's part of the general pattern of believing that the pillars of society are valuable to all the parties in society. Government likes telcos, telcos like telcos, platform likes telcos, big business likes telcos, and the people have a hard time not being squeezed out of the policy negotiation that results. So let's then ask the last question, which is, could we take over the platforms and use them to our advantage because they are more efficient? As I indicated in my talk, they're not more efficient. They actually generate whole orders of magnitude more technology to conduct surveillance and sell advertising than they do in providing services. They are grossly inefficient at providing the front side services, which is what they claim to be doing. And therefore, we don't need their engagement-focused, keep every human mind concentrated on the intermediary all the time form of business model, because we're not inefficient. A Freedom Box, my free software stack, running in a single board computer that costs $50 and runs on microwatts of power, providing all the services that a family or a small business needs, is many orders of magnitude more efficient than the platforms, doesn't require surveillance, can be protective against surveillance, and will be under the control of real people in their real lives, which is, as a credit card company would say, priceless.
Thank you so much for the response. We have some time for a couple of questions. Yes, Venki, please go ahead. Venki, you're muted.
Hi, sorry. Hi, Eben. Good to see you and thanks for that talk. My question was around Web 3.0, decentralized finance, and the kind of hype around it. Do you believe that one of the problems that we saw with Web 2.0 is that the centralized platforms, whether those are government platforms or private sector platforms, they have concentrated enormous amount of power within themselves. Do you believe that we can try and reshape that and redistribute the power dynamics in the new Web 3.0 era, or is that just too much of hype?
Well, hi, Venki. It's good to see you and talk to you. And because it's a really smart question, the answer, of course, is yes and yes. The amount of hype is overwhelming and ridiculous, and that's because there's tons of people looking for tons of money and getting enough of it to run the hype cycle even further. So that's true. Is there also a chance at something actually happening that reduces central power to some extent? Yes. Will central power try and prevent that from happening? Yes. Is it likely to win? Yes. But that's not just because it's all hype. That's also because power is real, and when you try and reduce it, it fights back with you. I cannot recommend too highly to people a book by my now tragically deceased friend David Graeber from 2011 called Debt, The First 5,000 Years. A history of money and credit from a perspective more or less like my own, or rather mine is more or less like David's. And what I want to mention by citing David's book is to suggest that there is, over the last 2,000 years, a long cycle between times in which money consisted of valuable metals in currency, and times in which the global and national systems of the great aggregations in human society were based on credit systems of virtual money. And that interaction had as its last cycle a period of currency, money, and valuable metals, which also corresponded to the great period of Western imperialism and expansion. Beginning in the later 15th century, around 1470 or so, and ending when Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard in 1971. So we are living, as David showed, in the period of the first few nanoseconds of what is likely to be several hundred years in which virtual money and credit systems come to be dominant in the world again. The good news is that that is often associated with lower levels of militarization and enslavement in the world. And the bad news is we're just in the beginning of it, and we have no idea what it's actually going to do. And this time is not like any other time. One of the things which is happening is that cryptocurrencies of different kinds are trying to become local virtual money systems. By local, I mean within communities, and asserting the importance of those communities above the national or other imperial structures, which have previously been the issuers and controllers of money. That's good. That's like leather money or suede money or seashell money or local credit within villages. And of course, here, Indian history over the last 500 years is the development and apotheosis of the village economy, which can make everything it needs and do everything it needs without having to use anybody else's money or to interact with the state above the level of minimal necessity. That's the great contribution of the traditional Indian economy to this discussion. But central bank cryptocurrency is just as crypto as non-central bank cryptocurrency. And what is happening at the moment is what happened twice in Chinese economic history. People have started issuing virtual money, and the state lets it go for a year or two and then decides this won't work. We have to step in and become the issuers of that money. And that's how Chinese paper money came to be invented twice over the long history of Chinese economic life. So we're watching at the early moment when, just at the birth of a new post-currency system in the world, hardly for the first time, we are seeing the confrontation between those decentralizing forces you're referring to and the centralizing forces which are already catching up. Then you add the criminals, who are always part of this structure whenever it happens, and you begin to notice that it's not a system that can be predicted. It's path dependent. History is actually going on. In front of the history actually going on is so much hype that nobody can understand it. And that's why history is done in the past, because it's really hard to do the history of the present. The question you're asking is a wonderful history of the present question. And the answer is, as I say, yes, yes, maybe, yes, maybe, who knows?
Thanks, Eben.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. And we have one question from Pallav. Pallav, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yep. Mr. Moglen, the question is this: so I have a hunch, but though I'm really inexperienced to say that, I would want you to kind of trash it or vouch for it. So, as and when a liberal order makes a resurgence, do you believe the platform economy will die its natural deaths?
Well, waiting for things to die a natural death can be very nerve-wracking, and it doesn't mean that it won't be pretty awful to watch. In 2009, in Freedom in the Cloud, I said Mark Zuckerberg had done more harm to the human race than anybody else his age. That was widely derided as a ridiculous and crazy statement. 10 years later, Mr. Zuckerberg is widely understood to have done a lot of harm to the human race by large parts of the human race. And what seemed crazy then is just, a little bit overhyped now. And I'm glad to have gone from being totally insane to just a little too intense. But of course, I also thought back then that if we built Freedom Box and put distributed social networking in it and put a good XMPP messaging system to replace WhatsApp in it and so on, and gave it away at price zero, and encouraged manufacturers of inexpensive single board computers around the world to use it, that we could get rid of social networking as we know it pretty effectively in a short period of time. 4 young men who were listening to my talk at NYU that night in 2009 made diaspora as an attempt to achieve the result. Mr. Zuckerberg contributed $10 to diaspora, for which I was unendingly grateful. And he's still here, and we're still waging the struggle. So as and when, as you put it in the beginning of your very perceptive question, it can take a long time. And as V.I. Lenin said, there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. So my view about this is that it's a state transition. It's nonlinear and unstable. You can't talk about it as and when. You can only make proof of concept plus running code plus hope. In my view, in your lifetime, not in mine, these questions will be decided. And in my view, what you do, as well as what I have done, will be decisive in its decisiveness. So, as I say, let's get out there and make some better technology.
Thank you.